Do you think your entire life could change in one day? Most people would say no. Many spend their whole lives waiting for the perfect moment before they begin to change. They believe they need more time, more money, more confidence, or a better version of themselves before they can live differently. So they keep enduring the same days on repeat. They keep waking up with that familiar heaviness inside. They keep postponing the things that matter most to them. From Carl Jung's perspective, every real transformation begins the moment a person dares to face the deepest parts of themselves, the fears they have always avoided. The unconscious beliefs quietly control their lives from the shadows. The shadow they have spent so much time hiding from the world and from themselves. One day may not be enough to turn you into a perfect person, but it can be enough to become the day you choose to walk toward a different way of living. And sometimes, an entire life only needs one awakening like that to begin changing direction. Stay with me until the end of this journey, and you will find the answer to the question from earlier. Not through some magical formula for changing your life, but by finally seeing clearly what inside you has kept you trapped for so long. 1. Self-disgust starts transformation. Every real change begins with a pain a person no longer wishes to endure. It is the moment they begin to grow tired of their current life, tired of procrastination, tired of helplessness, tired of repeating the same habits that slowly make them lose themselves more and more. People rarely change because they should change. They only change when continuing to live the same way becomes unbearable. You may know you need to sleep earlier, eat better, stop wasting time, tell yourself the truth, leave a dead relationship, or begin the work you have delayed for years. But knowing is not enough. Human beings can live beside the truth for a very long time without changing, as long as the pain remains within the limits of what they can tolerate. Then one day, that limit breaks. Maybe it is just an ordinary morning, when you look at yourself in the mirror and suddenly feel exhausted by your own life. You still go to work. You still smile and talk like every other day. But deep inside, a feeling grows clearer and clearer. I don't want to keep living like this anymore. That is not a weakness. It is the first sign of transformation. Inside every person, there is not only the part they want the world to see. Each of us carries a dark place within, what Jung called the shadow. It is like a room locked away for years inside the house of the mind. Inside it are the fears you do not want to admit, the desires you feel ashamed of, the laziness you try to deny, the anger you swallow, the feeling of worthlessness you hide behind achievements, and the truest parts of yourself that were once rejected and therefore forced into hiding. The problem is that what is hidden does not disappear. It simply learns how to control you from behind the scenes. You think you are only procrastinating, but beneath procrastination may be the fear of failure. You think you are simply lazy, but beneath that laziness may be the feeling that no matter how hard you try, you will never be good enough. You think you are only losing motivation, but perhaps what you have truly lost is your connection with the person you once wanted to become. Jung once wrote something deeply connected to this. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside, as fate. That is why some people keep repeating the same painful relationships. Some ruin opportunities the moment things begin going well. Some constantly say they want to change, only to return to their old habits at the end of the day. They are not stupid, They are not broken. They are simply being led by an unconscious part of themselves they have never truly faced. I once read a story online about Riley, a 36-year-old woman living in Seattle. She worked as an image stylist for a fashion retail chain, and from the outside, her life looked almost perfect. Riley had a refined sense of style, a creative career, and an Instagram filled with beautiful cafes and healing quotes. Her friends always thought she was living the dream life. But every night after work, Riley felt empty. She lay in bed scrolling through her phone until late, watching other people's lives while becoming more disconnected from her own. She saved videos about fitness, healing, and starting over, but never truly began anything. Riley kept telling herself she would change someday, but as time passed, she only became more disappointed in herself. One evening, Riley received an email informing her that the company was about to restructure its staff. What frightened her was not the possibility of losing her job, but the sense of relief that appeared first inside her. As if she had been waiting for something to happen so she could finally have a reason to escape her current life. And in that moment, Riley burst into tears. Not because of the job, but because for the first time, she realized the thing exhausting her most was having to continue living a life that no longer resembled who she truly was. This is where many people misunderstand self-disgust. If it turns into self-punishment, it will destroy you. But if you listen to it carefully, it can become a doorway. Because sometimes what you hate is not your true nature. What you hate is the old shell, the old habits, the old mask, the old way of living that once helped you survive but is now suffocating you. You do not hate your true self. You hate the fact that you abandoned that true self for far too long. Real change begins when you stop trying to make your current life a little more bearable. You stop searching for a few productivity hacks, a few motivational quotes, or one more habit just to endure the same old life a little longer. Instead, you begin facing a much more difficult question. If I keep living like this, who will I eventually become? That question is not comfortable, but sometimes it is exactly the thing that wakes a person up. Because pain does not always mean you are failing. Sometimes it is the sign that there is still a part of you that has not given up on yourself. A part still awake enough to recognize that your current life is not truly aligned with the person you want to become. It no longer allows you to remain peacefully asleep inside the performance. The day you begin to grow tired of your old self may not be the day everything changes instantly, but it may be the day you stop justifying the things that have been quietly making you suffer. And when a person stops defending their old life, something very deep begins to change inside them. The next part will speak about that very cage, the old identity you always believed was your true self, when in reality, it may only have been the place where you have been trapped for far too long. 2. You are trapped by your old identity. One of the hardest things to accept is that people are not only trapped by circumstances. Very often, they are trapped by the way they define themselves. You may think your problem lies only in your habits. You procrastinate too much, lack discipline, cannot stay consistent with exercise, do not dare leave the job that is draining you, or keep returning to relationships that hurt you. From the outside, all of these seem like behaviors that simply need correcting. But if you look deeper, the real problem is usually not what you do each day. It is the way you see yourself. That is your old identity. It is the quiet way you define yourself every single day. Not the image you present on social media. Not the polished version of yourself you show people at work. but the private thoughts that only appear when you are tired or alone. I've always been this way. I'm not the kind of person who can do that. I'm not good enough to start over. Maybe it's already too late for me. Human beings do not live by conscious willpower alone. Beneath the rational mind, you can see lies the unconscious, like the basement of a house. You may decorate the living room beautifully, welcome guests with a polite smile, and insist that everything is fine. But if the basement is filled with old clutter, dampness, and forgotten things, the entire house will still be affected. The unconscious is where memories, fears, beliefs, and reactions are stored. Things you no longer remember learning, yet they still shape the way you live. Most of a person's identity is formed very early, before they are mature enough to choose it. A child does not ask, "Who do I want to become?" They simply try to survive within their environment. If love in the family comes through obedience, the child learns to please others. If mistakes are punished, they learn to fear trying. If emotions are treated as an inconvenience, they learn to stay silent. If achievement is the only way to be acknowledged, they learn to turn self-worth into an invisible scoreboard. Over time, those lessons become something like a psychological operating system. You cannot see it, but it runs beneath every decision you make. It decides whether you dare say no. It decides whether you feel worthy of love. It decides whether you believe you are allowed to rest. It decides whether you choose an open and expansive life or keep returning to the familiar, simply because the familiar feels like home. That is what makes change so difficult. You are not merely trying to break a habit. You are trying to leave behind an identity that once helped you survive. And the old identity does not leave quietly. It pulls you back with familiar whispers. Don't try, you'll fail. Don't tell the truth, people will leave you. Don't change, you won't be loved the same way anymore. Don't dream too far beyond yourself, you're not that kind of person. I realized this very clearly during the time I worked as a content editor for an e-commerce company. The job was not terrible. My co-workers were kind. The salary was enough to live comfortably. The office always had free coffee and meetings where everyone tried to appear excited about new projects. But every morning, when I stepped off the train and walked with the crowd into those glass buildings, I always felt as if I were living a life that did not truly belong to me. I loved music deeply, and I had always dreamed that one day I might stand on a small stage, holding a microphone and singing the songs I genuinely loved. I had become so accustomed to choosing safety that I mistook it for my true nature. I used to believe I was simply a practical person, someone who disliked risks and was not suited for major changes. But one afternoon, while editing a headline for a mattress advertisement, I suddenly realized I was not practical in the way I had always believed. I was simply afraid. And all that time, I had been using the word maturity to hide my fear. That moment made it impossible for me to keep lying to myself the way I had before. I began to understand that the image of myself as someone who only likes safety was not my true nature. It was merely the way I had lived for many years, since childhood, always taught to be good, to be stable, not to disappoint anyone. That way of living once protected me. But over time, it no longer felt like protection. It became a cage that kept me trapped inside a life too small for who I truly was, preventing me from living honestly with my passion. The dangerous thing about a psychological cage is that it does not always look like a prison. Sometimes it looks like stability. Sometimes it looks like loyalty. Sometimes it looks like responsibility. But if a definition of yourself forces you to betray the things that matter most deeply to your heart, then perhaps it is not the truth. Perhaps it is only an old belief that has lived inside you for far too long. If you want to change your life, you cannot simply force yourself to act differently while still believing you are the same old person. Someone who believes they are worthless will sabotage even good opportunities. Someone who believes they are unlovable will experience love as something suspicious. Someone who believes they were born to endure suffering will find peace unfamiliar. The old identity will always try to prove itself right, even when doing so hurts you. So the first step is not becoming an entirely new person overnight. The first step is learning to question the old story. Look carefully at the sentences you continue using to define yourself and ask, slowly and honestly, is this truly who I am? Or is it only something I learned to survive? That question may not free you immediately, but it creates a crack in the cage. And sometimes, a single crack is enough for the light to begin entering. 3. Face your worst future. Most self-improvement advice teaches you to visualize a positive future. Imagine yourself healthier, more confident, more successful, living in a better home, doing more meaningful work, waking up with more energy each morning. There is nothing wrong with that. Human beings need hope to keep moving forward. But sometimes, beautiful visions of the future feel too distant, too polished, too perfect to truly reach the deepest trapped part inside you. Because there is a harder truth. Many people do not change because they see heaven. They change because they finally see the hell they have been quietly building day after day. That is why the anti-vision matters. Instead of only imagining the best version of yourself, try looking directly at the worst version you could become if you continue living exactly as you are now. Not to punish yourself, not to drown in fear, but to clearly see the consequences of the small choices you keep telling yourself are harmless. Scrolling on your phone until 2 a.m. once may seem insignificant, but repeated for years, it becomes a tired body, a clouded mind, a life that no longer has depth. Avoiding one difficult conversation may feel easier in the moment, but repeated long enough, it becomes a cold relationship where two people live beside each other without truly touching one another anymore. Delaying your dreams once may sound reasonable, but repeated over 10 years, it becomes a person filled with regret, always talking about what they could have done. An anti-vision is like pulling yourself out of the fog. When you are inside the fog, you can keep walking because nothing is clear enough to truly frighten you. You know your life is not right, but you can still tolerate it. You still have food, a bed to sleep in, small pleasures, distractions that help you forget the truth for a few hours. And this state of being not in enough pain to change is where so many people remain trapped. This is the moment when people become covered by illusions about themselves. Illusions are not always strange or detached from reality. Sometimes the illusion is, I still have time. Sometimes it is, I'll begin when things settle down. Sometimes it is, I'm not doing that badly. These sentences are like psychological painkillers. They do not heal the wound, but they numb you enough to keep walking down the road that is hurting you. Jung once made a sharp observation about the path toward consciousness. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Put simply, people do not truly change just because they imagine an ideal version of themselves. They begin to awaken when they clearly see what will happen if they continue living the way they are now while avoiding the truth. It is not a gentle or comfortable realization, but it is real, and sometimes that reality is exactly what changes a person. In the film A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge is a powerful example of anti-vision. He did not change because someone lectured him about kindness. He did not change because he was inspired by a beautiful future. What shattered him was being forced to witness the final consequences of the person he had become: a cold death, an empty room, people around him who were not grieving but almost relieved, and a life remembered with bitterness. Scrooge did not only encounter ghosts from the outside, he encountered images buried deep within his unconscious. Those ghosts were like psychological fragments he had denied: the lonely child from his past, the man who once had the capacity to love, and the shadow of a future where his heart had completely closed itself off. Each vision did not come to punish him. They came to do what his conscious mind had avoided for far too long: show him the full truth. What is striking is that Scrooge did not awaken when he was praised or comforted. He awakened when he saw his life from the outside, without any excuses left to protect him. He saw that the coldness he called realism had turned him into someone no one wanted near. He saw that accumulating wealth could not save him from loneliness. He saw that if he continued living the same way, he would not only lose other people, he would lose his own soul. That is the power of anti-vision. It does not ask who you want to become in your most beautiful dream. It asks whether you dare to look at the person you are quietly becoming. If you continue procrastinating, who will you be 5 years from now? If you continue swallowing your anger, what will your relationships become? If you continue using work to escape your emotions, what price will your body eventually pay? If you continue pleasing everyone around you, will there still be anyone left inside you to live your own life? These questions are not comfortable, but they carry a deeper kindness than empty encouragement ever could, because they do not allow you to keep deceiving yourself. They place you in front of a mirror that does not soften your face, erase your dark circles, or adjust the lighting. And perhaps for the first time, you no longer see the image you want to present to the world, but the true direction your life is taking. Seeing the worst possible future is not the end. It may be the beginning. Because once you clearly see the cost of not changing, you no longer need endless motivation. The truth itself begins creating pressure. Not pressure from society, family, or social media, but pressure from the deepest part of you. The part that still knows this life cannot merely become a well-organized form of suffering. Thank you for staying patient until the end of this section. Please continue to the next part, because once a person has seen the future they no longer want to live, the next question becomes impossible to avoid. What must be decided today so that the old self no longer remains behind the wheel of your life? 4. The decision that changes your life. After a person has clearly seen the cost of continuing to live the same way, the most important thing is not feeling emotional. The most important thing is making a decision. Not a weak promise spoken in a moment of inspiration. Not a beautiful plan written in a notebook and forgotten a few days later, but a quiet, serious decision with the power to cut something loose inside. I cannot continue being this person anymore. This is one of the deepest paradoxes of being human. We often choose familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom. A cage, if you remain inside it long enough, can begin to look like home. You know its dark corners. You know where the coldest places are. You know how to make yourself small enough not to hit the bars. And then one day, when the door finally opens, the first thing you feel is not joy, but fear. Because outside the cage, there is no map. That is why the decision to change your life is rarely cinematic or beautiful. It is usually very quiet. It does not necessarily happen during a long journey, a perfect morning, or an emotional breakthrough. It may happen while sitting in your car outside your house, unable to make yourself walk inside. It may happen while staring at your work calendar and realizing an entire month of your life has been filled with things you no longer believe in. It may happen when you finally recognize that you are too exhausted to keep pretending everything is fine. Carl Jung called the process of becoming your true self individuation. It sounds complicated, but in simple terms, it is the journey of gradually stopping yourself from living according to fear, expectations, and the roles other people placed upon you, so that you can return to the person you truly are underneath. Individuation is not about becoming extraordinary or better than everyone else. It is more like slowly removing the layers that have clung to you for too long. Some layers come from the way your parents raised you. Some come from society and the pressure to become a normal person. Some are formed from wounds, disappointments, or the fear of rejection. And some are layers you placed on yourself simply to feel safe and accepted. But eventually, you grow tired of living beneath all those layers. You no longer know which emotions are truly yours, which desires are real, or who you actually are anymore. That is why the decision to change always involves a kind of letting go. But letting go here does not mean giving up. It does not mean surrendering your life to drift wherever it wants. On the contrary, it is one of the bravest acts of consciousness. You let go of the version of yourself that tried to control everything because it was terrified of being hurt. You let go of the need to be understood by everyone before daring to live honestly. You let go of the story that says you must become perfect before you are allowed to begin. You release the old ego, not because it is hateful, but because it has completed its task. It once protected you, but now it is imprisoning you. The story of Stan Lee is a fitting example of this kind of transformation. Before becoming the name behind iconic characters like Spider-Man and Iron Man, he spent many years writing formulaic comic stories for a small publishing company. He wrote the kinds of stories the market expected, repeating safe patterns until he gradually lost all inspiration. At one point, Stan Lee even considered leaving the comic industry entirely because he felt he was living a life that did not truly belong to him. Before quitting, he told himself that if he was going to leave anyway, he at least wanted to create something he genuinely loved one last time. That was when he began creating superheroes, unlike the ones people were used to at the time. They carried fear, wounds, loneliness, and deeply human flaws. Spider-Man was not a perfect hero. Peter Parker worried constantly, struggled with insecurity, money problems, and the feeling of never truly belonging anywhere. Yet that was exactly why millions of people saw themselves reflected in him. A real decision does not immediately make life easier. Sometimes it makes everything harder. You must face uncertainty. You must endure the feeling of being misunderstood. You must stand inside the space between who you used to be and who you are becoming. You are not yet as strong as you wish to be, but you also cannot return to your old unconscious life anymore. This is an incredibly fragile stage because people often want to run back into the cage the moment freedom begins to feel cold. But it is precisely there that a new self begins to emerge. The ego is not arrogance. In the simplest sense, it is the feeling of who I am that you use to move through the world. The old ego was built from fear, habit, and adaptation. The new ego is built from choice. It is not stable yet. It is like a young plant just beginning to break through the soil, easily bent by the wind, but it possesses something the old seed never had. It has already begun turning toward the light. A life begins changing direction from that very decision. Not because every problem suddenly disappears, not because you instantly become perfectly disciplined, but because inside you a new boundary has been drawn. Before, you were still negotiating with your old self. You still allowed it to drive your life for one more day, one more week, one more year. But when the real decision finally happens, you stop asking, "How can I make this old life hurt a little less?" You begin asking, "How must I live so I no longer betray who I truly am?" That question can change everything, because once you have answered it honestly, you can never fully fall asleep again the way you once did. 5. Small actions create a new self. Change does not happen simply because you understand your problems. Some people understand very clearly why they are suffering, understand that they are procrastinating, understand that they are living through an old identity, and even understand the origins of their fears from the past. Yet after all that awareness, they still return to the same cycle, the same patterns of reaction. This does not mean awakening is useless. It only means awareness is the doorway, while action is the first step taken through it. After the moment of seeing the truth, a person needs to create the first crack in the old identity. The crack does not need to be large, but it must be real. It is a small action that makes the old part of you uncomfortable, because the action goes against the story you have believed about yourself for far too long. If you have always believed you are someone who cannot say no, the first crack may be refusing an unfair request. If you have always believed you are weak, the first crack may be keeping a promise to yourself in one very small thing. If you have always believed you must handle everything alone, the first crack may be asking for help. What makes a small action powerful is not its size. It is its psychological meaning. To outsiders, sending an email, walking for 10 minutes, scheduling therapy, turning off your phone before bed, or telling the truth in a difficult conversation may seem ordinary. But for someone imprisoned inside an old identity, these can become quiet acts of rebellion. No noise, no applause. No one sees how many fears you had to fight just to do that one thing. But inside, something has shifted. The unconscious does not change through ideas alone. It needs to be touched through lived experience. You may understand intellectually that you are not worthless, but if every day you continue acting like someone who cannot be trusted, your unconscious will continue believing the old story. The unconscious is like a child that does not believe long explanations. It watches what you repeatedly do. It asks one simple question: who are you really? And the answer is not found in your thoughts. It is found in your actions. The old identity is like a path worn through a forest. You have walked it thousands of times, so the grass has been flattened, the earth pressed down, and your feet automatically follow the route, even without conscious thought. To create a new path, you cannot simply stand there imagining it. You must take a different step, then another one. At first, the grass is still tall, and the ground is still hard, and it will feel unfamiliar. But if you walk it enough times, the new path slowly begins to appear. Discipline, in its deepest sense, is not about punishing yourself. It is the patient act of walking the new path until your soul begins believing this can also become home. I used to think that only by doing everything alone could I feel safe. When I worked freelance in content writing, I carried every responsibility myself, from brainstorming ideas, writing articles, editing content, communicating with clients, and studying more late at night. From the outside, it looked like hard work. But in truth, it came from the fear that if anyone stepped too close to my work, they would realize I was not as capable as they thought. There was a period when I worked so much that every morning I woke up already exhausted. I constantly tried to become the reliable person, but over time it felt less like maturity and more like forcing myself to endure. Then one day I realized the hardest thing for me was not working harder, but sending a message to someone with more experience and saying, "I think I'm overwhelmed. Could you help me take a look at the way I'm working?" That message only took a few seconds to send, but it took me nearly 2 weeks to gather the courage to write it. Because at the time, I believed asking for help meant weakness. But after I sent it, the greatest change was not in my work. It was in the feeling inside me. For the first time in a very long while, I no longer had to pretend I was always okay. And I began understanding that maturity is not about needing no one. It is about being honest enough to admit you cannot carry everything alone forever. If deep inside you believe you only have value when you are forcing yourself to hold everything together, life will continue creating situations that demand you keep forcing yourself. If deep inside you believe you are unworthy of love, you will unconsciously choose people who make that belief seem true. If deep inside you believe you cannot change, you will always find reasons to delay until the story finally proves itself. That is why one small action can become a ritual that breaks an old fate. Not because it makes every problem disappear, but because it sends a new signal into your psychological system. It says, "I am no longer entirely the same person I used to be." And sometimes, one signal like that is enough to create the first fracture in a wall that has stood for years. A small action is the first brick of a new self. Discipline, therefore, is not punishment. It is structured care. It is the way you tell yourself, "I will not abandon myself anymore." Some days, discipline is simply drinking water, going to bed on time, replying to a difficult message, or sitting quietly for 10 minutes instead of escaping into a screen. But every time you do these things, you are teaching your nervous system again that safety does not exist only inside the familiar past. Safety can also exist inside honesty, presence, and one small choice repeated long enough. Please stay for the final part, because once the first crack appears in the old identity, the remaining question becomes this: what happens if you stop postponing and finally allow that new self to fully enter your life? 6. Life changes when you stop postponing. Most people spend their entire lives waiting for someday. Someday they will start living better. Someday they will take care of their body. Someday they will write that book, leave that job, speak that truth, learn that skill, heal that wound, or become the version of themselves they quietly imagine during sleepless nights. But someday is a very dangerous place to send your life. It sounds gentle, but in truth, it is a waiting room without a clock. You sit there believing you are preparing, while time continues moving forward. You think you are waiting for the right moment, but often you are simply postponing the fear of meeting your real self. The future rarely appears like a miracle separated from the present. More often, the future is simply the present repeated long enough. If today you live in avoidance, tomorrow will only become a more sophisticated version of that avoidance. If today you betray yourself through small choices, a few years from now that betrayal will take on a clearer shape, a more exhausted body, a mind with less hope, a heart that struggles more to open, and a life filled with things that should have begun long ago. This is not meant to frighten you. It simply brings you back to a very simple truth. Life does not change direction through desire alone. It changes direction through a conscious action taken in the present moment. Procrastination is one of the most subtle ways the unconscious takes control. It does not always look like laziness. Sometimes it looks like preparation. You read one more book before beginning. You watch another video for motivation. You adjust the plan one more time. You wait until your mood improves, until your schedule clears, until you feel more confident, until you are no longer afraid. And all of it sounds so reasonable that you do not realize you are using logic to protect your fear. But there is a truth most people only understand after losing too much time. You do not need to stop being afraid before you begin. You begin so that fear no longer controls you completely. The moment that changes your life is not a perfect day. It is the day you stop accepting a life lived half asleep. You may still feel afraid. You may still not have all the answers. You may still tremble while stepping away from what feels familiar. But there is one enormous difference. This time, you no longer allow fear to decide for you. This is where consciousness begins returning. Consciousness is not overthinking. Consciousness is the ability to see what you are doing while you are doing it. When you are about to procrastinate, you recognize, I am hiding. When you are about to return to an old habit, you recognize, I am looking for numbness. When you are about to say yes only to please someone else, you recognize, I am abandoning myself to be accepted. That moment of recognition alone is already a beam of light. It does not erase everything, but it gives you back the power to choose. And the power to choose, when used today, can redirect an entire life. One day may not be enough to create immediate success. One day will not instantly make your body healthy, your career completely new, your mind perfectly peaceful, or all the wounds from your past fully healed. But one day is enough for you to stop renewing the contract with your old self. One day is enough to put down the excuse you have carried for too long. One day is enough to do one small thing your old self has always avoided. One day is enough to turn the wheel of the ship a few degrees. And sometimes, those few degrees determine whether you arrive at an entirely different continent years later. The greatest privilege of being human is not becoming perfect. It is gradually becoming your true self, not the self created merely to survive, please others, avoid pain, or impress the world. But that true self does not appear while you are waiting. It appears when you begin living more consciously in small things, the way you use your mornings, the way you keep promises to yourself, the way you speak honestly, the way you leave behind what diminishes you, the way you choose presence instead of disappearing into a screen. Maybe today is not the most beautiful day. Maybe you do not feel ready. Maybe you are still confused, still afraid, still carrying parts of yourself that have not healed. But life does not require you to become perfect before changing direction. It only asks that you stop using imperfection as the reason to remain asleep. The difference between an ordinary life and a meaningful one is sometimes not talent, luck, or a great opportunity from the outside world. Sometimes it is simply the quiet moment when a person says to themselves, "I will begin today, not tomorrow, not when everything becomes easier, not when I become someone else. Today, with this unfinished version of myself, inside this real life, through one small but honest first action." The most important thing you realize after all your inner crises is this: life does not truly change during comfortable moments. The deepest transformations are often born from long periods of suffering, procrastination, exhaustion, and the feeling of living out of alignment with yourself. It is the moment when you can no longer continue pretending that everything is fine. Maturity is not becoming more perfect. Maturity is when a person becomes brave enough to look directly at the shadow inside themselves, their fears, weaknesses, old identities, and the parts they have always tried to hide. Only by facing that darkness can a person truly free themselves from the psychological cage that has imprisoned them for so long. Life does not change simply because we wish it were different. It begins changing direction when a person clearly sees the truth about themselves, makes a new decision, and begins living as a different version of themselves, even through the smallest actions. One day may not be enough to change everything, but it is enough to become the day your entire life begins turning toward a different direction. If this video touched something inside you, please press like, share it with those who may also feel trapped inside their lives, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together through future videos about depth psychology, inner awakening, and the path toward becoming your true self.